Join us on the program right now, Clayton Cramer from PJ Media and the author of a book that I would recommend that you read. If you're going to read Michael Waldman's book, read Clayton's book too, Armed America, the remarkable story of how and why guns became as American as apple pie. Clayton, thank you, sir, for coming on the program.
No problem.
Well, since you are the author of Armed America, and since you did, you were the guy who was, I think, largely responsible for the takedown of Michael Bellil the last time we tried to see some revisionist history of the Second Amendment. I wanted to ask you about this, a new book by Michael Waldman, the Second Amendment, a biography, in which he says there was no individual right to keep and bear arms. The framers weren't talking about it. What they were talking about, as he told Mother Jones, was the right to fulfill a duty to participate in the organized militia. So, Clayton,
I've read that interview, and I've read reviews of the book in a number of places, and it is so apparent that Waldman has either read very, very selectively or is not being terribly honest with everyone else about the question on this matter. One of the things he points out in the Mother Jones article is that in 1991, when former Chief Justice Berger called the idea of the Second Amendment as an individual right a fraud, that was the consensus view. And it was not the consensus view. In fact, we have a long history of courts recognizing the Second Amendment as an individual right. They didn't always hold that it was applicable to the states. They sometimes said it only restricted federal law. Sometimes they came up with reasons why the particular law in question was not a violation. But this idea of the Second Amendment as protecting the right of states to keep militias or protecting the right of individuals to participate in militias, this is a very oddball idea throughout the history of how the courts have interpreted the meaning of the Second Amendment.
Okay, so when he says, for instance, that he says, quote, there were plenty of guns at the time of the founding. He says there was the right to defend yourself, which is part of English common law. But he said there were also gun restrictions at the same time. He said that there was an expectation that you should be able to own a gun, but they didn't think they were writing that expectation into the Constitution with the Second Amendment when they wrote about the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
I would say that the primary focus of the Second Amendment was a concern to make sure that the federal government could not exceed its authority. And it's very clear when you look at the rest of the protections of the Bill of Rights that these are individual protections. These are not protections for the states as a general rule. They are, for example, the right against the freedom of religious worship. That's clearly an individual right. It's not the right of states to be able to define what religious worship will be allowed in their state. The guarantees about freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, those are protections of an individual right. The protections against cruel and unusual punishment, again, clearly those are protections of individuals. They are not protections of the state. In fact, it's a fairly bizarre idea that in the midst of this list of protections that Representative James Madison came up with, that he would stick in one thing which was specifically a protection of the right of the state when everything else is of an individual nature. That doesn't make any sense at all.
It doesn't. And in fact, what strikes me is just there's no consistency, it seems, to Waldman's argument. He's also asked, he says, what are your thoughts on the historical argument that the Second Amendment is a civil right protected under the 14th Amendment? And he says, well, after the Civil War, there were a lot of freed slaves who were terrorized by white vigilantes. One of the purposes of some of the framers of the 14th Amendment was to make sure that they get guns. He said, now, the Reconstruction government that enforced the 14th Amendment also had some very strong gun laws, such as prohibitions on carrying concealed weapons. Just like the colonial period and the early revolutionary period, it was a very different time. What you had in the South was low-grade guerrilla warfare between the races. He says it's hard to draw the lesson of what we should do now in our urban society where assault weapons are available for sale from the Reconstruction era. So he acknowledges, he says that, again, this has never been seen as an individual right up until the 1990s when, of course, the big bad gun lobby got involved. But then he actually says, well, no, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there were those who wanted to use the 14th Amendment specifically to guarantee that these freed slaves could exercise all of their rights, including their individual right to keep and bear arms.
Yes, because in fact the single most common reason stated for support of the 14th Amendment was to protect the right of the freedmen and, to a lesser extent, of white Republicans in the South to be able to defend themselves against these mobs. And because there had been considerable misuse of gun control laws both before the Civil War and then after the Civil War as a method of disarming black people to make sure they couldn't fight back when the Klan showed up. The fact is that even before the Civil War, state Supreme Courts in many parts of the country had recognized that the Second Amendment was an individual right. Now they sometimes started to hem and haw a little bit about whether it applied to black people or not, but they at no point. You find one odd case out of Arkansas that says differently, but all the rest of them are in agreement. This is an individual right. This was not something that the NRA made up in the 1990s. Or maybe they have a time machine. Maybe that explains it.
Well, listen, Clayton, like I said, if folks are going to read Michael Waldman's new book, I would strongly encourage them. I would ask them to pick up a copy of your book as well, Armed America, The Remarkable Story of How and Why Guns Became as American as Apple Pie. I tell you what, I think, Clayton, I might actually read these two books side by side. And just we might have you back on the program here in a couple of weeks after I've had a chance to go through your book again and to read Waldman's book, and maybe I'll have some more precise questions for you after that.
Okay, no problem.
All right, Clayton. Thank you again, sir. Hope you're doing well, and glad we could talk again today.
Okay, bye-bye.
Clayton Cramer joined us again, the author of Armed America, columnist for PJ Media, but Armed America: The Remarkable Story of How and Why Guns Became as American as Apple Pie. And again, Clayton has been a historian on and for the Second Amendment long enough that this is actually the second go-round for this type of revisionist history. Again, Michael Belial had this piece there's a book, Arming America, that came out years ago, won the Bancroft Prize for Best History Book, and it was made up, basically. The assertions of Michael Belial that, hey, there weren't a lot of people who owned guns in colonial America. In fact, and colonial America was rife with gun control restrictions. Boy, I mean, they would have made the Brady campaign happy back then. Oh, you couldn't believe how hard it was to own a gun. And man, the Second Amendment never meant what it says. Again, we've seen this before because this is what they have. Stale ideas and trying to rewrite reality. If enough time goes by, most people have forgotten about Michael Belial's book. Let's try it again. See what happens.